We're now recording, and so over to Jan, Joakim, and Stefan.
Yes, thank you so much, Helen, for the introduction. And interestingly enough, I must also correct you on the title because it's the new normal, digitalization and the hybridization of work and education before and after the COVID-19 pandemic. And to us, this is a very interesting thing because Joakim and myself are involved in writing a paper on how we should define digitalization and digitization and what the difference is right now. And we've clearly distinguished that it means two completely different things. But that's a different paper than this one, so I won't bring that one up. But since we had the opportunity of being here, we're going to present this paper that was published in Interacting with Computers just last year, or in the process of coming out in a printed format also. So my co-authors, there's somebody that isn't muted in the background. If you could do that, it would make things easier. So I'm Jan Gulliksen, a long-time researcher in human-computer interaction. I was 25 years at Uppsala University before I moved to KTH in Stockholm, which is the Royal Institute of Technology. I am, since the last 6 years, also Vice President for Digitalization at the university, meaning that it's my responsibility to actually see to that digitalization happen on a strategic level. So that's me, and over to Joakim to present yourself.
Thank you. My name is Joakim Lillesköld. I'm an associate professor in systems engineering management. My background is electrical engineering and project management, and I've been in charge of electrical engineering educations for a long time, and now I've been in charge of digitalization of education here at the university. So I've been running that for many years. And currently I'm also just getting in charge of a thing post the pandemic called the Future of Engineering Education, which is a project trying to work with all the lessons learned from the pandemic.
Good, thank you. And Stefan?
Yes, I'm Stefan Stenbom. I'm an associate professor working at the Division for Digital Learning in the Department for Learning department. So in presentations like this, I say that I am Gulan's pedagogical hostage on these types of projects.
And Gulan, that's my nickname that is used by everybody in Sweden, but not so much internationally. So now you know that as well. Good, so we're going to take a bit turns here and present, and we'll save the last 15 minutes for discussions in the end. And I ask my co-authors to keep track of the chat as well if there are any things coming in, because I can't manage that at the same time. So we were just saying that before now, that do you actually remember what it was like before the pandemic? Because now it's been a few years since we were there, but I remember a situation I had as Vice President for Digitalization when our pro-rector, pro-vice chancellor was complaining about the lacking usability of our video conferencing systems, because it needed a secretary to at all be able to start a meeting. So he wanted me to look into if there were any new and more usable systems that we could use. And a few months later, everybody used these systems and they didn't need a secretary to use them. So clearly it wasn't actually the systems that were the problem in that sense. But just to remind ourselves, I just wanted to show a few sort of illustrations of what it was like. Maybe your office environments looks a little bit like this. We're getting to sit more and more crowded these days, and before the pandemic we were sitting in a lot of closed office cubicles, but also in open environments working in this fashion. But that's maybe possibly the administrative staff and a lot of the teachers and PhD students that sit like this, but we also have the researcher's environment that could look very much different depending on what you're working in, with a lot of technology that you have access to and work with at the same time, as we are a university with one faculty university with maybe engineering as the main things that we're doing. But then again, we're also responsible for the students' environment. And this is some pictures to sort of show you what it was like when we had students on campus before the pandemic and their work environment in this situation. Then the pandemic happened, and you remember what happened in relations to this. From a Thursday afternoon, I believe it was, there was a message from the president that within 1 week, everybody's supposed to work from home. We're going to lock our facilities, but you have to keep on teaching the way that you did before. So we were forced into these types of different work environments, which is also a totally different paper that I'm not going to talk about today, but looking into the home environments during the pandemic and what that looks like from a digital work environment perspective. We all, I believe, suffer from a lot of different systems that we're switching back and forth between all the time in this situation. And as HCI researchers, we often get down into analyzing one particular system and measuring the usability of that. But when you rather look into the entire picture, you hear completely different things. So maybe you're referring to all of these systems that we have here on the left-hand side, but what you hear when you speak to people in the coffee room is that I get far too many emails. The system is crashing all the time. It takes too much time to upload our digital videos to the online repository where they're supposed to be stored and so forth. And it's these frustrations that we should use as a mechanism for actually develop and further do what we're doing. So based on that, we decided actually then that in the middle of the pandemic, when we saw this happening, we saw that we could actually make use of our own transformation. The fact that we're living in historical time to try and gather so much data as possible about the things that are happening here, and also to help us guide and make the best possible decisions for the university. And this was from our case in this that we wanted to share with you today. When we did our studies of related research in relations to this, when we actually wrote the paper, there were actually a few of the first studies that just had been published where you could see that for example, that before the pandemic, it was only 5% of Americans working from home 3 days a week or more. But in April 2021, a month into the pandemic lockdown, 37% worked from home full time, according to these reports in the situation. But I think it's important also to emphasize the sustainability aspect of this. From one study, we could see that 60 million fewer commuting hours per day when the pandemic happened, which is an enormous positive effect towards our environment in that sense, resulting in 9 billion saved work hours, only counting the first 7 months of the pandemic, according to this study by Barrero et al. In this. Interestingly enough, when people save time, I mean the commuting hours that you spent on things, it was 35% of that time that you saved was spent on working more, and the rest of the time was then spent on what we call the unpaid home work that you tend to do in this sense, which is also an interesting thing where you can actually bring in equality perspective into this as well. What's interesting is also to try to look at what kind of hard data is there available on this. And probably you know of the studies that Mary Savinsky and the others at Microsoft have been involved with, where they've been looking at the future of work and based on their measurements of their different Microsoft systems and their use. Of course, you can. This is similar to Hofstede's studies, that you could criticize them for being sort of looking into one very particular client group of this. But given that Microsoft products are used worldwide, it's kind of interesting to look at it. 70% wants flexible work conditions to continue. 65% or more wants more time together in teams, and then not Microsoft Teams, but actually working with different types of teamwork in this. 66% of decision makers are considering redesigning their offices for hybrid meetings. Interesting in that sense. So there's a lot of data that you can get out of these studies. They have an entire website dedicated to the different types of work they do at the work lab at Microsoft that I recommend looking at. It updates fairly often as well. What they did was also they looked at particularly the use of their product, so they could measure that when the pandemic happened, the time spent in Teams meeting increased with 252%. It sounds like a lot, but I think that we will show that we actually have seen much more in our studies of what happened. Average length of meeting increased from 35 minutes to 45 minutes, which is also interesting to consider that. 45% more chat messages, 42% more after business hours. And the number of email messages increased with 40.6 billion under the month of February from before the pandemic to after the pandemic in relations to this. So clearly there's a lot more work with the digital tools that happened due to the pandemic. I care a lot, as many of you know, about the work environment issues, and I also thought that this was a very interesting thing that you could see where you had the rise of the triple peak day, that apparently when people come home from work after they have had their dinner, there's a new peak coming here that seems to be happening, which reminds me of the situation when I was a parent myself and tried to get along as a young researcher. I said that my working times was 9 to 3, with the only problem it happened twice every day. And that is maybe how you can perceive things. So this was trying to look at things happening in relations to the work settings. I wanted Stefan also to talk a little bit about the education setting for this.
Yeah,
over to you.
And following up from the discussion we had before the formal presentation start, I would simply start by saying that as with reinventing things, I mean, doing online learning is nothing new. It has been around since the 1980s, 1990s. And there is somewhat problematic situation that we have seemed to have reinvented much of what is already known regarding online learning and blended learning. But since some fundamentals are then basically that we do blended learning, which sort of combines in-person and online learning. And there are several different ways how you can conceptualize this. There is a quite interesting paper from 2019, I can put it in the chat, where they try to define different sort of conceptualizations of these concepts. But what we can say, if we use some sort of quantitative measure, we can say that KTH was 15% online before the pandemic, if we compare the activities going on, while I sort of prefer a more qualitative focus of how to conceptualize it, where we see that online learning are in essence activities that takes place where you as a student and you as a teacher can attend that activity where you want. And it could be also that activity occur at any time that you want. And that means then how we differentiate what we call asynchronous to synchronous online learning. So that's sort of the way to start. But when we introduce technology into educational experience, we can do that using sort of 4 different strategies that are on the next slide. Gulan, please. We can introduce technology in educational just as a substitution, where technology acts as a direct substitute with no functional change. We can do it to augment, where we still have a direct substitute, but with some functional improvement. We can have modifications where technology allows for significant task redesign, and redefinitions, which is basically that technology allows us for the creation of new tasks that were then previously inconceivable. And perhaps looking back at Jan and Joakim and the other papers that you're working on, that perhaps the difference between digitization and digitalizations happens between the A and the M in this slide. So perhaps something are already there. Next slide, please. So what have we seen has happened in education during the pandemic? Well, a term that actually was invented during the early days of the pandemic is emergency remote teaching. And emergency remote teaching refers to courses that were originally designed to be delivered in person, but were switched to online delivery due to an emergency event. It has happened several times before the pandemic. One of the more well-known situations were the big strikes that were in Hong Kong I think it was in 2019, 2018, where they had to close down the universities and quite rapidly move into online delivery. The results of these courses often consist of simply rescheduling learning activities from campus to digital meetings, and that assessment are substituted with digital alternatives. So what I'm saying here that we also want to differentiate and distinguish these emergency substitutions associated with a rapid transfer in relation to these thoughtful creation of online courses that are well integrated between online and face-to-face activities that are associated with high quality blended learning. So from an educational perspective, to summarize, the pandemic has provided very many faculty and very many students with a personal experience from what online or remote learning can be. The scale in which online learning has been used is, of course, without question high. It hasn't been as high before, but it has to a very large extent been in the form of emergency remote teaching by substitution and augmentation, and not in the terms of high quality online learning. And I think that is something that we must keep in mind when we are now moving forward. And I think that's over to you, Jan.
Yes, and so what we wanted to do here was to look at what data do we actually have access to that could help us to justify the things that we were seeing happening. And we were having a lot of quantitative data on the uses of our different digital systems that turned out to be very interesting when we started to go through them, and compare that also to the various decisions that were made by the top level management, because those are all stored in our online diary, where you can follow that in a completely transparent way. But in parallel to that also, we all worked in various groups to try to tackle the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic, particularly on our education. So we've also made use of and analyzed all of the meeting notes, formal meeting notes that we have from those meetings, or the informal notes or email conversations that we've had about that. And also I would want to emphasize one thing that I think is important, that people talk much more about in subjects like anthropology or ethnology, that we also saw the writing process in itself as a research process, where you go through and actually questions your material and see, can we really make these conclusions based on this? And as many of you know from before and from my background, I'm always basing the work a lot on that these projects are actually action research projects, meaning that we're in and dealing with and studying something where at the same time we are a part of that process. And that may look like a not very scientific way of doing it, but as a matter of fact, in action research, it is the way of doing things, as long as you're are explicit with your roles and how you actually deal with your own possible influence on what you're doing. So we had this as a background to what we were doing, and also we had a long discussion with reviewers on the methodology and how to justify that. And for me, I think that this is one of the fundamental papers that I always go back to in this sense, where Klein and Myers try to set up a set of principles for conducting and evaluating interpretive field studies in information systems. So here is 7 principles that we try to adhere to this. Just to take an example here, the fact that we are 3 different researchers from completely different domain that have been a part of this process and trying to sort of mirror each other's different backgrounds in the analysis of what we're seeing as just one important thing of this. Or the principle of suspicion, where we always try to go with a critical analysis of this. Can we really be sure that this happened, and couldn't it have been the opposite instead? So now over to the results, and to quote one of the people that do not want to be given with a name, they said that, oh boy, if I knew that it was this that was required for the digitalization of the university to happen, I would have started it a long time ago. Of course, with a lot of respect for all of those that had problems and occurred different things during the pandemic, it is actually true that a lot of the digitalization happened very quickly just because the pandemic happened. And we're going to go through a few of the different results in relations to this. And I'm again going to hand over to Stefan and Joakim to talk us through these interesting images over our data sets. Over to you, Stefan.
Yeah, so one way of analyzing what actually happened in the pandemic was to simply look at the usage and the scale of which our systems that are used to deliver education were affected by different processes throughout the pandemic. So what you can see on the slide here is simply our uses of Zoom at our university at KTH in the terms of meeting hours. And meeting hours is then defined if 2 persons are having one meeting and the meeting length is 1 hour, then it would count as 2 meeting hours. You also see in the sketch here that the different weeks are having either a green, a yellow, or a red color. And the green color means that this was a study period. A yellow dot means that it is an exam period, and the red dot means that it is a holiday period. And then we have the different years. Following here on the pink line first, you can see, which is then 2020, you can see that before the pandemic, the average use of Zoom was about 500 to 1,000 hours, meeting hours per week, which then rapidly extended up to 80,000 hours. We can see some up and downs here, especially reflecting when we were off work. You can see the summer period, and again, then it goes up for the fall, and we have a different patterns then coming over and over. Which sort of reflects basically what happens at the university. We can say that from the minimum to the maximum, I think it was 13,000% from week per week, which was the change of use. So 250% seems rather low. But at the same time, we have different measures of doing so. What is also quite interesting to see here, since this is what has been submitted to the journal, is that during 2022, after we have submitted this paper, we can see that the use of Zoom has found a new sort of normal level, which is actually much lower. So in the fall of 2022 and early 23, we can see an average of about 35 to 40,000 meeting hours per week. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
You want to comment on this as well?
Yeah, sure. And this is then the use of Canvas, and Canvas is the learning management system that we have at KTH. One one can see here in the same manner the different study periods, exam periods, own work. And you can see sort of one pandemic effect, which is, I don't know if you can point to that, Gulan, so that we all can see, or I'll try to annotate it. Yes, perfect. That's where the pandemic hit, and that's the pandemic effect that we can see, that we have a change from 1 week to the other. Another interesting change that we can see looking at this is that people started to use the learning management system also for exams to a much larger degree. So if we see, for example, if we compare 2019 here, you can see that during the exam period, the use of the learning management system went down, while during the pandemic, it more typically went up, especially in the beginning of the pandemic where we had a full lockdown in Sweden. What we can also say is, if we look to what has happened since this paper was published, is that the use of the learning management system seemed to continue to increase. So if there would be a line for 2022, it would look something like this. And we have this same cyclical pattern, which means that we have our study periods here. So when a course starts, in the first week, you typically have quite a lot of going in, looking at the learning management system, and then that constantly decreases throughout the study period, which is a known pattern for us. So, and to give you some sort of perhaps more applicable sense, a typical day like today would be on average 30 to 35 clicks per second at the learning management system at our university.
Good. And we also gathered some data on support inquiries. Is it possible to say something based on that? So
these are the requests, the tickets that are sent from faculty and support to the educational support, the e-learning support at the university. And what you can see here is also a pandemic effect coming here with a rather steep increase. And here we have a cyclical pattern, but on the opposite side. So if you look at the study period about here, you can see that in the beginning of the study period, there are a lot of questions, and in the end of the study period, there are a lot of questions coming in. One can see some sort of steep increase during the first weeks, but then after a while, it seems to turn back to having rather normal pattern. Yeah.
And also we were looking a bit on the Wi-Fi use. Joakim, you want to say a few words about this?
Yeah, I can say a little bit. We when looking in the systems, we can only see how staff and students use the systems we had at the university, but we couldn't follow their behavior. Were they staying at home? Were they sitting in school? What would they do? Especially a little bit into the pandemic, since KTH actually was semi-opened. But if we look in, and unfortunately, this we can only get out a graph, a picture from the system. We cannot get out the raw data. But we can see here that we came from every year, basically, since we started measuring this, which was 2009, it increased by 1,500 units. And this is the wireless units, which means that a person that has an iPad and a phone would have 2 units if they are connected to the Wi-Fi system. And we basically dropped from 20,000 units a day on campus down to, or a week, but on a daily average, down to 3,000 and stay there. And then after we opened up campus, you could see that it went up to around a little bit less than 15,000. So the number of units didn't come back. And actually, when we submitted the article, we still could see that all units were slowly coming back, but not as much. So people really changed their behavior during 2020 and 2021. And then yeah, we have to update. We haven't updated this picture to see how many units that's on campus today. But once again, this is a little bit more tricky data in the sense that we don't have the statistics on users. So this is the number of units on campus.
So interestingly enough, also I can take over and talk a little bit about personally what happened during the pandemic. As I was forced to stay at home, I had also recently graduated one of my PhD students, Helena Tobiasson, who was looking into office work and the fact that we actually are feeling much better and making better decisions if we can move at the same time. So I actually wanted to check out whether it was possible to switch to a walking situation for the meeting. So during the entire spring of 2020, I was having my meetings as this, and basically meetings was what I was having as being a vice president of this. So I spent 4 to 4.5 hours a day on digital meetings in a walking format like this, with this device hanging and keeping my telephone up there. And it worked beyond all imagination well. You could think that it would bounce quite a bit when you're walking around, but actually it wasn't. Also the interesting thing was that when I talked to the various people I had meetings with, they seemed to think that it worked pretty well anyway, and they didn't think that there were too much problems with sound or quality or things like that. So nowadays, when we're at hybrid meetings that we nowadays mostly have, there's always a few people that are doing it online while walking, even if not many use this silly device that I tried doing in this. During the spring of 2020, I lost 10 kilos and walked about 25,000 steps every day in that. So clearly it can have some benefits to do this as well. An interesting thing that I just wanted to trigger your brain to start thinking about things in different ways was also whether we are not digitizing our meetings that we have at the university. We tend to move them into the digital meeting format without adapting the ways that we're doing. So at one of my study visits to Canada before the pandemic, I actually came across this thing that I thought was quite fascinating, where you have a more or less an iPad on a Segway that greeted you when you were coming to a meeting where they were only they couldn't attend physically to the meeting. So they greeted me there, walked with me to the meeting room and showed me the coffee machine. And then when it was time to sit down at the meeting, they lowered their iPad to reach my level and could turn towards me. And then you could create all of these informal meetings that you have where you speak two people to each other before a meeting. You know, what people tended to be missing the most with the pandemic was everything that happened on the way into the meeting, when you were picking up your coffee cups and were solving a problem with one of your colleagues in that way. So if we could think about technology in new ways on how we could do that, I think there's a huge potential in rearranging the things that we're doing in that respect. Here are some observations that we could see in this process as well. We could actually see and hear from a lot of fellow co-workers, particularly in the administrative domain, that they felt that their productivity was increasing due to the pandemic. The fact that they could work from home meant that they actually could deliver more cases per day than they could beforehand. They could actually still go and pick up their children and work full time on things. So they felt that there were a tremendous increase in efficiency. On the other hand, the business development of the university processes just didn't happen, because those are the things that happen when you actually come and meet each other in that sense. Then about the digital education and digital assessment, over to you again.
Yes, and can you then switch slides? So I will.
Yes.
Or yeah. So as Jana said before, one of the premises for this research is that we have also been involved in the development and as Joakim indicated, he is the chair for educational IT at KTH, and I'm the what we called a domain owner of e-learning at KTH, also as our contribution to the university. So we were very heavily involved also in this process. So what did we do at our university? Well, we had a crisis organization for education, which consisted of an extended committee for first and second cycle education. We did appoint an operational leader, that happened to be me, that coordinated and prioritized KTH resources in order to support faculty and students. We changed then the focus, of course, of examination into remote exams, and we established specifically designed task teams for digital meetings and videos, since there were very many people that needed help to start working with those things, and also to have the systems were online all the time in order for them to be used with the increased usage. We also made a special task force for local support, meaning your local admin at your different departments and so, to help them to help you as faculty members. Next slide, please. I think we'll skip this one since we are sort of running out of time. So next, please. So what basically happened at our university was that the synchronous learning activities were moved to online digital meetings using Zoom instead of on campus. Some teachers started doing teaching by videos with pre-recorded lectures or recording their live lectures, something that is still there now, almost 3 years later. We could see an extended use of collaboration features in the learning platform. We saw increased use of self-study material, and we saw some quite innovative solutions for laboratory work. Everything from people that, Jan, can you please mute your microphone while thinking? Thanks. Some laboratory work where the lab assistant were in the lab hall doing videos or having remotes. We also had one interesting teacher that divided his students up into lab groups depending on where you were living, and then sent out the lab equipment all over Stockholm, and rented a car for the lab assistant so that they could drive around the car throughout Stockholm, helping out students doing their labs in their own homes. Next slide. When it comes to examination, it is very clear that we are very much still depending on proctored exams in-house. We did digital examination with camera proctoring, like Zoom exams that many universities employed. We could also see an increased use of home exams, and especially oral exams, an increased use of oral exams, where you started to do oral exams instead of paper-based exams. After that initial lockdown during the most beginning part of the pandemic, we did though started to do some written exams on campus, and actually the two things that first moved back to campus was laboratory work and room-based exams. Yes.
Good. And so I think one of the main outcomes that we've thought on this was that we clearly distinguished a few different phases of this transformation that we wanted to share, and that's maybe the big theoretical contribution to that. Many of them are self-explanatory, but the pre-pandemic phase that we talked about, what it looked like before March 2020, when we went into a complete lockdown, you all remember what that was like in terms of teaching and work in that sense. But then in the emergency remote phase, everything closed down quickly, and people spend a lot of effort to actually make this happen in a good way. And we actually managed beyond everybody's expectation well in given that situation. However, people were putting a lot more efforts into work than you normally would expect people to do. But then on the other hand, we were sort of thinking that this should come to a stop because Donald Trump said that it would stop by Easter, right? So therefore we can do the extra work now while we have to do it in this way. But then we went into something that we call the new normal. And when we talk about the new normal, we're thinking about this situation where all the work that we do happened in a digital format. We went to digital meetings, we were collaborating in digital meetings room, we were co-authoring documents in digital meeting rooms, and we were thinking that this was the new normal in this sense, but still hoping that it would get back to something else. But then all of a sudden, the pandemic started to drag on, and new things happened that you would think that is this really the way it is going to be? I need to deal with my work situation in a completely different way. So in the slow acceptance phase, we were facing that maybe we need to actually handle the way we do work differently to be able to manage this. And then maybe the most interesting phase that would give the name then to the paper was called the new normal, which is what would happen then once the universities decided that they could open again. And here we could clearly see a dividing phase. There were those saying that they wouldn't the only thing they were longing for was that every student will come back and every staff would come back to what it would look like beforehand. And particularly in the administrative staff, they were actually ordered back home or back to work full time, simply to show that they were working in that sense. So this new normal phase is then torn between those who wanting to return to what it was before the pre-pandemic, those living in this new normal digital life, and those thinking that maybe we actually learned a few good things during the pandemic that we should try to institutionalize. So for example, having big one-way communication lectures in big rooms maybe is not happening. I'm just going to finish with an anecdote that we also have put in the paper on something that happened at the very end in this, and that was when we were in this slow acceptance phase and we were having more and more meetings. Every day was filled with digital meetings from 8 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the evening. At one point, I was actually called to 2 meetings at the same time. And being innovative digital, I thought, well, maybe this would be something that was actually be possible to solve. So I decided, well, I do have 2 ears and 2 different devices. So I connected one device to one ear and the other device to the other ear, and informed both meetings that just so that you know that I happen to be in 2 meetings at the same time. People were saying that to me afterwards, that we're also in 2 meetings at the same time, but we've never told anybody. But I wanted this to be obvious. So I said, when I switch off my camera, it's because I'm speaking in the other meeting, so that you just don't think that I've forgotten to mute myself or do something differently. And it turned out that this worked beyond all expectations well. When I talked to the people that were in these different meetings, they said that I acted just in a normal way in that they thought I was present and could contribute in both meetings. I could actually even bring information from one meeting to the other, so it could increase the quality of this. So I've actually tried this out quite a bit, and I've discovered a few things that could maybe constitute guidelines for doing experimentation on this for the future. It is an advantage if one of the meetings has a PowerPoint presentation. It is an advantage if both meetings are in the same language, for example, on this. I also tried 3 meetings at the same time. That didn't work as well. Then I couldn't do emails in parallel to the 3 meetings to be able to manage that. But maybe you will see this more as a joke, but I actually use this example also that we should maybe question all the meetings that we're having, because meetings tends to be something that is increasing all the time. And I want to question if that is actually very useful for us to have it in that way. So we wanted to stop there and say thank you for listening in on this, and have 10 minutes for a few questions here in the end, or comments from people. And here are also our email addresses if you want to get in touch and discuss this more. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much to Jan, Joakim and Stefan. A really interesting talk. I have some questions, but I'll let other people ask questions to start with. So Alistair, would you like to go first? You have your hand up, and then I'll come to Liz. Unmute. Yep.
Thanks, Helen, thanks, Jan, and your co-authors. Interesting talk. One just comment, Jan, I really admire your cognitive resource. It'd be a good one for Wiccan's multiple resource theory. How you attention slice like that, you must be an outlier in terms of ability. Anyway, the point, it's really a future research point, and it's probably more for Stefan. One of the things I do besides the odd bit of research is I'm a school governor in the UK. And remote learning became very much the thing in COVID. So anecdotally, I could draw a similar curve to yours. And actually it's going on at the moment, because in the UK we're going strikes with the teachers. There's no surprise, UK is such a mess these days. And hey presto, we're adapting. So we're back partially into remote learning, sync and async. Okay. No, I think the point is that I've sort of come across is that maybe your new normal, you might want to think about the power structure of technology, because one of the issues in particularly education is if you're using the technology, the actual authority balance between school and pupil changes. In other words, by and large, use is discretionary. And it's now become quite an issue in the UK, because quite a few kids, usually the ones who need it most, in other words, they're not that well motivated, aren't being reached by the technology. So this could also be a case for students as well. It's an interesting thing about participation and the power structure, because the technology intervenes in the middle and to an extent is neutral. So quite a Giddens structuration theory point there, Jan, if you want your IS perspective.
I should maybe comment on your first comment first, saying that I'm not unique in terms of having capabilities to double cognitive processing at the same time, but I've become quite good at time sharing. And jumping back and forth between the meeting actually means that the meetings aren't that dense. They have a lot of air in them, so it's possible to do that. So,
cognitive load.
Yeah. So for the other question, I'll leave it to Stefan then, if you want to comment on Alistair's point.
Sure. And I mean, I can only agree with what you're saying, that the pandemic has sort of raised a new perspective of a digital divide when it comes to socioeconomic backgrounds and things like that. And I'm doing a research project also in K-12 to look at these types of things. And what we in this study have looked at is the teacher perspective, but of course we also have the student perspective, very much when it comes to things like study techniques, their physical environment. I mean, we had examples in another study of two students living together in a one-room apartment, where they were discussing, okay, should you or I be in the restroom before lunch, and then we switch during lunch. So we have all those things that we need to take care of also, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Maria, would you like to ask your question now?
Yes, hi. So thanks for an interesting talk. And quite appreciate the kind of landscape of changing of how we're using digital tech and how that might have impacted. And I like the kind of characterization of the different phases and the different kind of types of usage. So the emergency kind of situation that we found ourselves in being a bit different to kind of what we settle, how the dust settles afterwards, as it were. Insofar as kind of the digital tech space is concerned, I'm also curious as to whether you've appreciated the potential knock-on effect of legacy communications, as in, I'm thinking that we anecdotally at least are observing the demise of the phone call. And, in that space, it's that ability to just quickly check in with somebody about something that would save you a few emails, or walk down the corridor or knock on the door and so on. And so now we find ourselves engaging in Teams conversations, perhaps, or so we schedule the meeting usually as opposed to calling people on the fly. And I'm also kind of curious in terms of kind of the literature around Zoom fatigue and so on, or so-called Zoom fatigue. A kind of the potential impact that's kind of having on our kind of cognitive space as well. So, with the phone call, we kind of we didn't have the visual stream, so we weren't kind of self-conscious about how we were looking, or looking at many faces. So, yeah, I'm just kind of curious as to whether you know of any data about the demise of the phone call. Perhaps that's another research project.
It clearly is. I guess that Joakim and Stefan may have points on this, but I could just from my own experience say that phone calls actually stopped during the pandemic because everybody was in meetings, so nobody had the chance to answer the phone. So typically people made a phone call to make people have an alert that I want to do chats with you, or I want to send you a text message or something like that, rather than actually wanting to speak to people. And then you could do these short meetings with people, but typically the booking system didn't allow you to have more than less than 30-minute meetings, so it was kind of difficult to do these 5-minute things that you wanted to do in that sense.
Yeah.
I wanted to follow up on that as well, because clearly we realized the advantages of working from home and using digital technology more during the pandemic, although we didn't ask for this. But now I think I feel people are struggling with the new normal of combining the physical with the digital. And particularly I find meetings where some people are in the room and some people are not in the room are really, really hard. So I think HCI has something to contribute there. We should be really studying that. And your iPad on a Segway is an interesting development, but it doesn't cover all the possibilities. So I'd like to see much more along those lines.
And actually, we have made, Stefan and I, together with another colleague, Björn Turesson, have made a study, and I'm just quickly showing you the slide I skipped over on that, on hybrid education and hybrid meetings, together with one of the folk education organizations in Sweden, to try to develop how this could work in a good way. And what we could see clearly was that it was as much a technological issue as it was a pedagogical issue, as it was a leadership issue to manage these kind of things. But often we tend to blame the technology, but most often it's actually the leadership that fails in a meeting. And those that do the best digital leadership in hybrid meetings, I find, are the students. They seem to have another capability of understanding how they should deal with hybrid participation in that sense.
That's interesting, because the other point I wanted to raise, which puzzled me during the pandemic, and I think we missed a trick, was that we all went on to teaching over Zoom, but it was incredibly difficult to get, in the UK at least, our experience I think generally was it was incredibly difficult to get the students to engage. And that was really frustrating for the teachers. And I remember teaching, I tried to teach a practical, and I sent students information about what they should do and what they should bring, and it seemed like really fun to me. So I ran 3 practical sessions with 60 students and 3 students engaged, which just left me sitting at home by myself in the middle of the pandemic, feeling really miserable.
Yeah,
We actually have a new meeting at 3 o'clock, me and Joakim, but I'll if I can leave off Joakim to go and say that I will be late, I can stay and try to answer.
Yeah, you
I'll do that.
can't be giving a seminar and doing a meeting at the same time. We expect this.
Back to back.
I'll thank you. I'll run off and do that, Jan.
Yeah,
thank
please.
you very much.
Thank
and you leave the questions to you guys.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank you,
Jan, you need an avatar, you see, to go and your presence elsewhere. Just a quick couple of comments. One on, I think, Maria, don't overrate the death of voice and phone calls. I think in the social context, you'll find the phone call and voice is still alive and well, even if it's mediated through WhatsApp these days.
Yeah.
In the work context, I think it is different. And then going back to Helen's point, I think absolutely the engagement is interesting, and that goes to power structure, but also what we know from the early days of CSCW is that presence and dialogue gives you a much directer engagement that you cannot really replicate virtually, in spite of dear Mark Zuckerberg's intent with the metaverse.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, Helen and I have experienced this also when we, for example, have program committee meetings where half of them is in the room and the other half is online. And eventually it turns out that the only way to get a decent, equal meeting going is that if everybody connects to the digital meeting, even if they're in the physical room. But we're getting there to the technology becoming better and better so that, I mean, eventually, we won't have that delay, I think, when we talk to each other, so that we could actually jump in and interrupt each other, even if you're a bit delayed in the digital room in comparison to the physical room. And we're also at my university then working with actually rearranging some of the rooms to be furnished to fit to a better hybrid meeting structure, which I think improves a lot as well.
Yes, we're also doing that at York, and I think the technology is not excellent yet. We have a thing called an OWL, which creates hybrid meetings, but I think it's a step in the right direction. And I think it's not beyond the power of HCI to solve these problems eventually. But it is our moment in HCI. I'll just finish by telling you a funny story about voice. I have a colleague whose modus of communication with me is to record a voice message and then send it to me via WhatsApp. And I find it's the most irritating and odd thing in the world, because I can't just glance at WhatsApp. I have to stop and I have to listen to the voice message, and then I don't hear him, so I have to play it again. I think that's a really weird combination of old and new channels of communication.
Well, it's just like my boss that decided that we would now get into Slack as the main communication channel. And now people send emails to each other saying that you have a message in Slack. So yes, I think that we have sort of failed in those aspects as well.
Yes, yeah. Okay, I think people are needing to leave and you need to go to a meeting. So thank you for a very stimulating talk. And just to say, for those who are still here, the paper is available on the Interacting with Computers website already. It's this strange situation that it's in advance of publication, so it was there in December, but it will be a 2023 paper, and there will be a formal volume in the next few weeks. And the next talk is going to be the 17th of April, because the last week of April, many people will be at CHI, including myself. So, and it's going to be Bridget and her colleague also talking about global teamwork, virtual teamwork. Sorry, I don't have the title in front of me, Bridget, but she's nodding vaguely.
Global virtual teams, and it was conducted with an international software development company, in fact, with one of the staff there, Phelan Barry.
Right.
So during COVID. So I'm sorry I'm being called away as well, but I want to thank you for a really interesting talk and all the day. It's lovely to see it.
Yeah, one of the things we miss, I find on Zoom, is that we need a little clapping clip so that we can clap people auditorily, or we all have to do the deaf waving. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you,
Good
Helen.
to see you,
Bye-bye.
Jan. Take
Thanks.
care.
Good to see you. Take care.